I'm Bill Plant, CBS News. I've had the intriguing assignment of covering the State Department for the past 3 years, a time of many history-making diplomatic breakthroughs. And I've traveled around the world with the Secretary of State. Along the way, it was hard not to notice and observe the arrangements and the people who make it possible for U.S. diplomacy to operate under the most adverse and difficult conditions. Security at State has been around for 75 years, and it's quite a story. It begins in 1916, in the middle of World War I. Security became an important issue for the department. Robert C. Bannerman was one of the first special agents hired to work in the newly formed Office of the Chief Special Agent. Some of his stories about those early days are related by his son.
One of the main purposes, which occurred in the period from, I'd say, February 1916 to April 1917, was directed to install a telephone tap in the German embassy. Now, all of this was directed by Secretary Lansing, who ordered the establishment in 1916 of the Office of the Chief Special Agent. And the purpose of this was to provide him with information, as he directed, on sensitive matters which he couldn't otherwise obtain from any other department of government, nor from the public realm. A report was written and placed on the desk of Secretary Lansing of the most important events over the tap for the preceding 24 hours. It may have convinced Wilson that the German overtures towards peace were not sincere, and this led the president to go ahead and declare war on Germany in April of 1917.
Following World War I, special agent activities diminished considerably. In the new era, the secret mission of the Chief Special Agent was no longer required.
The functions were mainly in support of the department activities, namely passports, frauds, visa frauds, inquiries about business, assistance to American business as requested by consular officers, consular court actions, and various things of this nature, and particularly the investigation of personnel entering the Foreign Service. In 1936, when I first entered the CSA, we were a very small office. We had about 4 agents and a supervisor and a chief special agent in Washington, and there were about 4 or 5 clerks involved. We covered the whole United States with these 4 agents.
And these 4 agents found themselves with more demanding responsibilities, as changes in Europe led to espionage involving visa and passport fraud.
Demands on the CSA were greater and more complex than ever before. It was not a simple investigation. These were intricate relationships of people and organizations sponsored by foreign governments. So there was a clear distinction from that time CSA and the old time when we had just a few agents covering the whole United States.
The attack was carried out by Jap torpedo planes together with dive bombers and horizontal bombers coming in waves.
With our entry into World War II, the department was tasked with the detention and exchange of all Axis diplomats in the United States. This work was turned over to the Office of the Chief Special Agent for the duration of the war. After the war, the Office of Chief Special Agent became the Office of Security, and its mission expanded.
Well, after World War II, the principal effort was to establish this broad-scale security program for the State Department, something we'd never had before. And this included Foreign Service security, State Department security in buildings, people, organizations, whatever, see. And this was a tremendous task to establish and get going. So this was the big emphasis. Now, the other department and agencies were trying to do it, but we were way ahead of them because we had forethought as to how this should be done. And it was received by the department very fully, and we had very little opposition. They agreed on the principles on which we were working. So This was a major step forward and is the basis for the entire security program as we know it today.
As a result of revelations of Soviet espionage during the post-war years, congressional committees became interested in security clearances for employees at the Department of State.
In 1952, the president had signed directives which required that all persons occupying sensitive positions in the government be investigated fully and be granted a top secret clearance. In order to do that, the Office of Security had to put about 200 agents on the street and in the halls of the department in order to conduct these investigations.
The relationship between the Office of Security and the Old Guard Foreign Service was definitely a confrontation. You know, you had to do the job. Yeah. And it was put on us, of course, by the Congressional Committee. It wasn't anything that grew up within the Department of State. This was a mandate that Congress laid onto the State Department to go out and investigate these people, find out who they are.
1952 was a significant year. In addition to a heavy investigative workload, SY was confronted with a new technological threat. The Great Seal, given as a gift from the Soviets to our ambassador in Moscow, was found to contain a listening device.
The Great Seal and the finding of it was a catalyst which brought the security countermeasures program to the attention of many of the high-ranking and policy-controlling officers around the government. The money became available. The appropriations, I don't know just how the seal was presented to appropriations committees in Congress, but I do know it scared some of them. And in this way, it was a good thing.
During this time, most agents handled investigations, but some were assigned exclusively to the protection of visiting dignitaries and the Secretary of State.
Years ago, when I first traveled with the Secretary of State, there was never any more than 2 men who would travel with Dean Acheson. The pay we got for overtime during my era might, if you were lucky, amount to $0.25 per hour. Per hour.
At a time when public debate over America's preparedness is at a peak. Pounding display of block rage by Khrushchev and his cohorts. The body is borne to St. Matthew's Cathedral, with Mrs. Kennedy and the President's family walking in humble prayer behind the caisson.
One day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Anyone who had any investigative arm investigated me at the request of the special agent in charge, not at the request of the State Department. I should make that clear. My first day coming into the field office, I was greeted by the Assistant Special Agent in Charge, Harold Ramsey. He greeted me with open arms, and most of the agents here, they took me out to lunch and whatnot and made me feel very welcome. The following week, the boss, the special agent in charge, he came back from vacation, and I was primed to meet him. And that meeting, I would say, was a little different from the meeting that I had with Ramsey and the rest of the agents, because the first words out of the boss's mouth was that you are not here by any choice of mine. I prefer Irish Catholic agents from Fordham University, and you don't fit that category.
The emphasis was gradually shifting. We still had a great deal of background investigations in our field offices. Visa fraud cases were an emphasis, but we started to get into the protective security era.
The biggest worry agents had when they'd be assigned to the detail was not making the plane in the morning. This, of course, had all changed through the turmoil of the 60s.
You say you want a revolution, well, you know, we all want to change the world.
The turbulence of the era and the unpopularity of the war in Vietnam created anti-American sentiment and made our embassies and people overseas more susceptible to attack.
From that point on, being an employee of the U.S. Embassy worldwide, you were immediately a target for opposition groups. And of course, headquarters responded with the CBs, armoring of vehicles.
The Guatemalan government said it has identified the assassins of United States Ambassador John Mine. It offered a reward for information leading to their arrest.
In the late 60s, some extremist groups began to believe that they could make political gains through terrorism.
They were some pretty tough times. All during my time in state security, the table of organization kept dropping and dropping and dropping our slots until terrorism hit. And then we started to get money like mad, and we started putting out the handbooks on terrorism of how to cope with it overseas, varying your routes, never using the same way twice, and what to do to your homes. We went out and started to survey all the embassies, all the glass palaces that they built that they wouldn't let us put fences around. And we started training of our officers. We were sending them to special schools to learn how to do defensive driving, how to hit another automobile to turn the car so that you could get away. I'd like to think that we brought what I consider SY into the 20th century.
I went down to Puerto Rico with that presidential summit, and that was quite a thrill to see the heads of these various countries, the most powerful countries in the world. And here we all are standing in the same building, in the same patio, and it gives you a nice feeling that there's a young kid from Harlem standing here with the world leaders. Who would have thought? America's a great country.
Getting into the miniaturization of using the microchips and so on is a transition from the days of the horse and buggy to the man walking on the moon.
Okay, we're go.
We're go. Same type. We're go.
I don't recall any such set of facts.
I'm not aware of it.
I'm not sure who or when.
I'm not quite certain.
I don't recall, excuse me, I don't recall the conversation.
I can't say.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
We are disillusioned because, in some ways,
in spite of the differences of opinion.
I came on board in late April 1972. There was no special training available at that time. I might not have received much training, but I certainly received a lot of advice. One item that will always remain in my mind was, when you go on protective detail, wear a woman's suit with skirt, not a pantsuit. If we had wanted a man, we'd have hired a man, was what I was told.
If the 60s were the embryonic age of security, then the 70s was really the expansionist period because of the various terrorism attacks. The protective detail on the Secretary of State was formalized during that period. They had always had people protecting him, but the exact number and how it would follow cars and things of that nature were expanded and more or less codified at that time.
Good evening. Another major Arab terrorist incident tonight. The American ambassador to the Sudan and quite a few other Western and Arab diplomats apparently being held hostage in Khartoum, the Sudan.
Before it ended, American Ambassador Roger Davies and a Cypriot employee of the embassy were killed. During the demonstration, heavy shooting broke out, with most of the shots directed at the ambassador's office.
I think the advent of terrorism has affected the life of the SEO by putting more requirements for technical security systems into our facilities. The SEO is no longer concerned only with locks and safes, but with an increasing variety of increasingly sophisticated technical security systems to protect our facilities.
The evacuation of our embassy in Saigon demonstrated the need for better emergency planning at our embassies and was a prelude to more involvement by the ambassador and the entire embassy in security issues at post.
I was in Vietnam from 1973 till April 75 when we evacuated. I was the last official American to leave the embassy on the morning of the 30th of April. The evacuation plans for Vietnam, and as I said, were developed over a period of 1 year. They were seen by the American ambassador about 4 days before the final evacuation, in which he approved the plans. The difficulty with that, the only people that understood the plans were the security people. And it's a little bit too late to approve plans 4 days before you leave. And what I'm leading up to, this is why we now have crisis management, why we have exercises, why we insist on emergency action plan to be developed and to have it disseminated through the post so the post understands it. That's why we have emergency action committees, which we didn't have at that time in South Vietnam.
Back home, agents on protective details were having problems of their own.
I was looking and scanning the crowd, and I looked to my left and then back to my right, and as I turned to look back to the left, I saw a startling scene of an arm extended with an object in the arm pointed directly at Mr. Retchevitz's head. At that time, I had an instinctive reaction was to lunge as I perceived the threat, and then we fell to the floor and began to grapple on the floor with this potential assassin. I think the struggle lasted for almost a good 30 seconds, at which time I informed Horace Mitchell to grab his other arm and try and brace it behind him. Well, Horace Mitchell grabbed the arm and he put an arm lock on it and twisted the arm, and the arm went around once, twice, and the third time I looked, and to my astonishment, this individual's arm had popped off in Horace Mitchell's hand, and Horace was standing there holding this guy's arm from the hand all the way up to the shoulder. Well, we later learned that, in fact, the individual had only one arm and that this was the prosthetic arm that Horace Mitchell had twisted off.
After they were taken prisoner and blindfolded by their captors, members of the student
At least 146 U.S. Marines and more than 80 French troops were killed when their separate barracks were blown up this morning in 2 separate attacks.
As the digging and searching went on, the Marines came under sniper fire, causing them to go on alert and take cover.
With the increase in terrorism throughout the world, Marine security guards have had to become more alert. And that's basically, I would say, that's one of the big reasons why the program has expanded so much. Years ago, the training did not focus on the operational type things. The training was more focused to how to be a diplomat, social etiquette type classes.
The single incident that truly led up to the formation of the Inman Commission was the second bombing of the embassy in Beirut.
The Inman Commission really set the foundation for development of standards for technical security, physical security at our facilities overseas.
We recommended upgrading the bureaucratic structure to focus on security problems constantly. Creation of a Bureau of Security.
What the couriers do, in fact, is provide security for those diplomatic pouches from the highly secure vaults from one embassy to the other, or from an embassy to the Department of State. We provide the security that the Marine Guards, the walls around the embassy, the vaults provide in an embassy setting. Why the Inman Commission included it is really not known, but the fact that they did, I think, merely recognized reality. The courier is not a postman. the material the courier carries is not postal material, is in fact the most highly sensitive material that the government of the United States possesses.
I would say in connection with the Inman Commission, it really defined the mission of the Diplomatic Security Service and defined our mission into the future, with the emphasis now on counterterrorism, expanding our technological security capabilities, and also requiring that we as agents acquire additional skills in order to conduct our protective security responsibilities and to carry out our regional security officer mission overseas. So it was something that provided the diplomatic security with more resources in terms of personnel, money, and equipment to meet the challenges of the future.
As a result of the Inman Commission recommendations, the Bureau of Diplomatic Security was created on November 4, 1985. But this was not the beginning of security at the Department of State. For the past 75 years, literally thousands of men and women have made it possible for the United States to safely conduct diplomacy throughout the world. This presentation is a tribute to their service.